Hello, and welcome to the fourth webinar of the series Constitutionalism, Trade, Social Justice and Sustainability in the Americas, Lessons from the 2020 Global Pandemic. The series is co-organized by the Initiative on Global Law and Policy of the Americas of the University of Houston, directed by Professor Elizabeth Trujillo, with the Center for Latin American Studies of the University of Bologna, which I represent here. We can also count on the co-sponsorship of the American Society of International Law Latin American Interest Group. Previous webinars have addressed the impact of the pandemic emergency on social justice, international and global law, sustainability, health, and climate change. In all cases, the discussion has analyzed the different relevant layers from a legal and political perspective, namely international, domestic, and local. On the website of the initiative, you can find the entire schedule, which is what you are seeing today. This is the fourth webinar. We will have also a fifth and a sixth webinar in the upcoming weeks. Today's webinar deals with another essential aspect, which is the impact of the pandemic emergency on international trade. It will have a slightly different layout in comparison to the previous webinars, because Elizabeth and I could rely upon three experts on trade. We had three experts on board, and so we decided to change the format. In fact, today's moderator, Frank Garcia from Boston College, will serve as both moderator and discussant. And also Elizabeth Trujillo will comment on Gabrielle Marceau presentation. At the end, as usual, we'll have a little time for a Q&A session. I invite you all as participants to write your questions in the Q&A chat of this meeting. We expect a lively discussion as we have more than 150 participants enrolled from all over the world. We would like to thank you for being with us today. And let me just very briefly introduce today's moderator / discussant, who will then introduce the speaker and the other discussant. So Frank Garcia is professor of law at the Boston College Law School. He's the author of 2 volumes on trade, of course, published by Cambridge University Press. He's also the co-author of another volume titled Rethinking International Investment Governance Principles for the 21st Century. And he's a member of the editorial board of the Oxford Journal of International Economic Law. Let me thank the speaker and the 2 discussants today. I will give the floor to Frank. Thanks again for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sabrina, for that introduction, and thank you to you and Elizabeth for the invitation to join this series. It's a tremendously timely series, and I think we have a very interesting event for you all today. It's my pleasure and my honor to begin by introducing Dr. Gabrielle Marceau, who will be our principal speaker today. She is currently senior counselor in the research division of the WTO Secretariat and has worked in a number of posts within the WTO for over 25 years, most recently including being in the cabinet of Director General Pascal Lamy and serving as acting director of the Legal Affairs Division. In addition to her work at the WTO, she has managed to find time to be an associate professor at the University of Geneva, as well as a visiting professor at a number of prestigious institutions around the world. In addition to that, she has published extensively in WTO law and international economic law generally. So she brings a great wealth of experience, academic, institutional, and legal into the conversation she's going to be having with us today. And before I turn it over to her, I also want to introduce our co-discussant and your co-chair of the series, who I'm sure you know well, Professor Elizabeth Trujillo, the Marianne and Lawrence Faust Professor of Law at the University of Houston, and the founding director of the Initiatives in Global Law and Policy for the Americas. Professor Trujillo specializes in international trade and investment law, energy, sustainable development, as a prolific and well-respected author, and is, I understand her book will be coming out at the end of this year from Cambridge University Press. And in the process of working on it, she has been a Max Planck visitor, as well as having been given an Alexander von Humboldt Foundation Fellowship. So it's really a remarkable group assembled here today to dive into these questions. And without any more, I would like to hand it over directly to Dr. Marceau. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. And of course, thank you to Sabrina and Elizabeth for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I was quite impressed by the experts sharing the panel with me today. And when I saw that Frank was involved, I thought, wow, I have to make sure that I say sort of intellectual things, a few, because my idea was to share the perspective as an insider with practical sort of inputs. So my goal today in this 15-20 minutes is to talk about three main aspects of the role of the WTO and of trade during COVID. And one is the WTO itself. Then I'll talk about some of the unique proposal that has been triggered by the crisis, both on health and third on environment. So the first document that my colleague Nikki will share with you is the WTO website, because the WTO during the COVID crisis, right from the beginning, became a transparency hub where governments were invited to notify their trade-related COVID measure so that other governments can see well what their neighbors are doing. So you do have a list of goods that you can consult. If we click, for instance, just to give a few examples, and then you have one on services. So if you look at the list of measures affecting trade in goods, again, just a few examples, some export restrictions, some temporary elimination of tariff, some export ban. This call for transparency is a repetition of what happened in 2008 during the financial crisis, when the G20 mandated DG Lamy and the WTO to receive all these notifications, because the first solution to collaboration and coordination is, of course, transparency. So there are also a list of measures in services, Nikki, if you go to services. And there are also, just to give examples, a few of them, there are hundreds and hundreds of those measures. They're notified country by countries, and countries are invited to speak to each other. And of course, finally, there's some in intellectual property. There's some in TBT and SPS, a lot of flexibilities, a lot of countries, accelerated customs sort of transfer. And this was done in the WTO in a virtual manner. Another thing that is new is the role of the Secretariat, because as you can see, for the first time, the Secretariat was invited or took the initiative, and this was highly appreciated, to have some sort of expert analytical report. There has always been the TPR report. We know the Secretariat is involved in dispute, but this is the first time. There's a long list, I think, close to more than 35 sort of reports on different issues to help governments deal and understand their obligations in times of crisis and specificity that is relevant to their needs, whether for animal trade, trips, and etc. So a new role for the WTO as an institution, and what it has led to is also, and that's another document I'll ask Nikki to share, the pandemic itself called for, as I mentioned, collaborations, but we made a compilation of the innovative type of PP, what we call the PPP, private and public partnership. So just to give you a few examples, Nikki will point to them, but this, if you're interested, you can have access. For instance, COVAX, we know this one. Several governments, IGOs, private, together to produce a vaccine that will be distributed to developing countries and others. But there's more than that. There's one that I especially like that was reported in the press, which is mentioned for Africa, the so-called UPS COVAX. That is, again, UPS, a distributor that offers its network to help distributing vaccine. And in one of the article that I read, Coca-Cola was also considered, because of its multiple fridge, as being invited to collaborate in this distribution problem. So the more and more, the last one that I'd like you to look at is the one between the US government, Johnson & Johnson, and another pharmaceutical companies, where Johnson & Johnson got the patent and Merck's didn't, but offered its capacity, and this was pushed by the government, to help and increase production. And there are many of them. The applications, for instance, to control beds in hospital was done by competitors, by traditional competitors. And the last sort of collaboration that I'd like to mention, the one announced on Friday, and we have the White House fact sheet here, but it is a deal between US, Japan, Australia, and India, where Japan and US will basically invest into India producing, and with Australia distributing in Southeast Asia. And this is sort of each partner using its expertise. Of course, it's a great, but it's highly insufficient for dealing with the world. I understand that this deal, the Quad deal, will allow to cover for less than 10% of the need. But still, it's a first step. The second part of my comments today is how the COVID has forced governments to react, of course, and has led to unique and innovative proposals on health and access to medicine. And this has also pointed to an enhanced role of the WTO Secretariat and the DG. So one of those first proposal is the EU proposal of June 2021, where they came with a concept paper. I'm sharing with you this paper briefly because I thought it may be useful for you in your future work or research. Of course, we cannot go through everything, but I thought it's going to give you a sort of a physical contact with the reality. So the EU started with an impressive broad proposal in June. Go down a little bit, Nikki, where you see that they had ambitions for all sorts of things, tariff eliminations, and then what are essential goods, different disciplines, etc. This led later on to an expanded group called the Ottawa Group. The Ottawa Group in November put forward a more narrow proposal, but supported by more countries, again dealing with what were the obvious trade restrictions on masks, ventilators, and now vaccines. And the following document that I'd like to share with you is the draft decision of the Ottawa Group. And why do I share this? To say that governments, we have seen in WTO years and years and years to negotiate things. For this declaration, as an example, it took 2 months, and drafted text was put on the table. It's not accepted, but it is a step. All sorts of also quick reactions. The next proposal is a proposal by different countries, including Latino countries, against export restrictions of vaccine in particular from the EU. So essentially noting the restriction, and in the bottom of the document, it's a commitment or a call for EU to change and an expression of concern. The following sort of proposal, again, a bit earlier in time, but across, horizontally relevant across, is the India-South Africa waiver request and the debates that have come. This is also part of the overall picture where these countries and many others, I think they're close to 100, are of the view that the best way to enhance and deal with the pandemic is to set aside IP rules during the pandemic, or at least for a while. This is still resisted quite a bit, but it is highly debated. And in parallel to this, there is an extraordinary document that came last Friday, if I'm correct, and it is a proposal here from a group of countries. And if you go down, Nikki, the document, a proposal basically saying that the WTO members, and in particular the Secretariat, should facilitate discussions to enhance vaccine production capacity. And this followed in a way a speech of our new DG Ngozi saying there's a lot of work to do in WTO, but in parallel to all this work, we all need to work at facilitating, of course, vaccine production in developing countries and everywhere. But what is interesting is that the document refers to the role of the Secretariat, and at the bottom end of this document, the last paragraph, encouraged the Director General to report. So it is a call for the WTO Secretariat to help this enhanced vaccine production capacity in addition to its regular work. If you're interested, we have the speech of the DG, and my last few points concern another dimension of COVID, is the environmental perspective, because we cannot set aside the simple point that this pandemic was caused by the way we live. There's no point in attacking one country or the other, and I'm not saying that finding out the origin of the pandemic is not important. My point is more modest than that. It's something environmentalists have been saying for years. We need to deal differently with nature, with the environment. And the pandemic seems to have shaken up countries with 4 fascinating proposals. The first one that we can mention is the proposal that I call the GSI, this proposal concerning plastic. That is to say, I think now, Nikki, you're putting, the plastic trade. Plastic is an interesting issue because government had started reducing consumption. Of course, with the pandemic and the need to be careful, plastic increased. But the point was, there's a recognition that we must deal with the issue. Another new group of negotiation was founded in December, called for the creation of a sustainability agreement, sustainability discussions. Eventually, we're not too sure how broad this will go. There is a first report because this group already had a first meeting on 5 March. And on 5 March, they met, and you have this very transparent reporting, and we're told that governments involved in this subgroup of negotiation will have NGOs and other actors involved directly. So quite a revolution, but a recognition that we cannot solve problems such as the pandemic unless we deal with sustainability. And the last proposal that I wanted to share with you is one from the United States, again, quite unique, where the United States, in simple terms, seems to be saying, you exporting countries, if you do not take actions to protect sustainability, we will consider that this is free riding, if you go at the end of the document, and this is considered to be by the exporting country a subsidy to its firms that do not have to do enough on sustainability, and it will allow the US or the importing country to impose countervailing duties. How this relates to the EU Green Program and the EU border tax or CBA border adjustment is not clear. The EU has not put forward any such proposal so far, but it has discussed in committee the need for tackling climate change. So I will stop with this. It's a bit dry what I'm doing, but I thought the best thing I can do is to share with you what it means in practice within the walls of the WTO. I'm in my office in the WTO at the moment, and I can only say that, of course, there's tragedy. It's not my point, but sometimes there's a say, I think, in English that says, never miss a good crisis. So the crisis seems to have shaken up governments so that they realize, as many repeat all the time, that we need to take action because this is really a world problem that shows that all humans are equal. Because until the last African or the last Asian is protected, vaccinated, or immune, countries, every single citizen, even a rich country, is under threat. This is what a pandemic is, bringing us back to our deep nature. So thank you for this time.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. That's a really, really helpful and insightful review of everything that the WTO is doing. I think it's not always clear to the larger community what the WTO itself is doing. It's so often the case that the WTO gets branded with what its major member states are doing or not doing. And I think you've outlined some really important work that the WTO itself is getting a chance to do. And I want to return to that in a moment, because I think the steps that you outlined, the role that you outlined is absolutely key, I think, and not just for the pandemic and for our response to it. I think it's really key for the WTO to emerge from this, to be clearly seen as part of the solution and not part of the problem. And I think I want to just say a few words about that opportunity and about that challenge. It's easy to forget right now the context for the pandemic, that we were in the crisis before this crisis, and it was that crisis of globalization, a crisis of nationalism, a crisis of loss of faith in multilateralism, and all of that has affected how countries are responding to the pandemic, of course. And I think it's important to touch that, because we are now able to start looking ahead towards what is going to come, hopefully, after this pandemic. And I think in that sense, it's really important that we use this opportunity not just to restore the status quo, but to rebuild a larger faith in globalization itself. And I think confidence in the WTO and its role is key for that. With that in mind, I think I want to turn next to this question of the TRIPS waiver. And here I think it's important to distinguish what the WTO as an institution can deliver, which is not a TRIPS waiver, and what the powerful member states can either achieve or not achieve. Unfortunately, whatever the powerful member states do and don't succeed in achieving will be painted onto the WTO for good or ill. So I think it's a really important moment in the WTO. So I think the TRIPS waiver is important for substantive reasons and for reasons of optics. And I'll just say a word briefly about each one. In terms of substance, I think everybody agrees that there is a need for fast, organized, and profound action to respond to the vaccine inequality issue. And it's not a surprise that wealthy countries are holding on to their vaccine supplies. We would expect that. But the question is, what can the global community do to break out of that? And I think, as the new Director General has said, there are lots of things that can be done and should be done at the same time. But I think the TRIPS waiver is actually key to that, because I think that in order to facilitate rapid, across-the-board mobilization of investment capital, technology, and know-how, I think you need a structural response to a structural challenge. And I think the waiver is that kind of structural response. It's been said that we should give existing modalities time to work. You know, there are some avenues. You outlined some new ones. There are some existing avenues in terms of compulsory licensing, et cetera. But I think it's a mistake to give them too much time to work. I think the precautionary principle would tell us right now that time means lives. And so I think there's a need to do something urgent and structural and rapid. In terms of optics, I think that this is a key moment for the WTO with respect to the waiver as well, because of course people are remembering the past pandemic in terms of HIV/AIDS and all the controversy around the role of TRIPS in hindering or helping the global response to that pandemic. So I think this is an opportunity, a necessary opportunity, to reverse those negative images. and for the WTO, really here I'm speaking of its powerful member states, to be seen as actually in this crisis, putting people and their needs ahead of the sort of entrenched inequalities and profit that of course drive the global economy as they should, but in no way should stand in the way of this kind of response. So I think the optics is actually key here as well. And that brings me to my last point, and I'll end with that I think it's a time of crisis that we look to actually facilitate the political and institutional changes we need to rebalance globalization as we rebuild it. And I think that's really what we need to do. We need to rebalance it. And I think in that sense, the TRIPS waiver is an important piece of that, because if it doesn't, if the institutions and the entrenched patterns don't change in a time of crisis, then they're not going to change. And I think people are looking to see whether or not they can reinvest in these institutions. And I think how the WTO response is part of that process. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Now we're going to hear from Professor Trujillo.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Gabrielle, for that compelling presentation. I feel very humbled to come after two wonderful experts in trade, two people who I consider to be mentors and friends. So it's quite an honor to be part of this discussion. I really share some of Gabrielle's positive sort of outlook on the future of the role of the WTO and the future of trade in the context of the pandemic. But at the same time, I also share some of Frank's concerns that the optics really matter, and how this is an opportunity for true institutional transformation and sort of reconfiguring the role of trade as not being part of the problem, but also part of the solution. And so before I go on with my comments, I wanted to just also thank Sabrina for being here, for her collaboration, for co-organizing this webinar series with us. I wanted to thank ASIL, the Latin American Interest Group, who is also co-sponsoring this webinar series, as well as my own institution, the University of Houston, who has been very supportive in launching this new initiative. So my comments are going to be focused more sort of on a little bit of a broader perspective of some of the challenges that I see in the framework of trade as it exists today, but also end on a positive note in terms of where I see its role, moving forward, and picking up on some of the points that Gabrielle mentioned in terms of not only managing the health pandemic, but also some of the parallels that we see with the environment and ensuing climate change challenges that we have. So as Frank correctly noted, many of the challenges we see today were in existence pre-pandemic. Before 2020, we saw a rise in protectionism, not just in terms of increased tariffs, but also non-tariff barriers. And we saw some efforts to try to solve some of these things through regional and bilateral agreements, like the TPP, for example, that focused a lot on some of these non-tariff barriers, reducing some of these barriers, as well as CETA, the Canadian-European Trade Agreement. These types of agreements, these mega deep agreements, have placed a lot of emphasis on things like sustainability, energy, digital economy, IP protections, and regulation, et cetera. In the last, of course, 4 years, we saw, especially from the United States, sort of this America First policy, which made the United States withdraw from some of these agreements, as well as sort of from globalization in general. But it's not just the United States, as Gabrielle and Frank noted. Many countries have, particularly with the rise of a pandemic in which the focus has been national concerns, and understandably so. With the onslaught of this pandemic, trade has decreased around the world about 20% in 2020. WTO has estimated around 13 to 32%. US trade and exports are down, particularly with respect to automotive and airplanes. With its primary trading partners, China, Mexico, and Canada, US trade is down by 20%. And we see a rise in what we've been calling vaccine nationalism, right? With this rise of export restrictions by many countries. even for countries within the EU against one another. So, according to the International Trade Center in 2020, 94 countries had placed export restrictions on crucial medical supplies, but import restrictions were lifted for essential supplies, particularly from the developing world. As of March 2021, 98 countries have these export restrictions in place. The EU has introduced more with respect to the vaccines. The US has extended the application to prioritize allocation of personal protective equipment for domestic use until June of 2021. And developing countries continue to liberalize the import restrictions, right? So Brazil, for example, has canceled its anti-dumping duties on components for vaccine distribution, such as plastics, sterile needles and syringes from China. So it seems like, we have this sort of export restrictions going up in the developed world and import restrictions going down in the developing world. So this is part of the trade story that we see now, that we're learning from this pandemic, that in times of emergencies, export restrictions tend to go up, particularly in the wealthiest of countries, and import restrictions go down, particularly for developing countries. And this seems to make sense, right? It's an obvious result that national governments will focus on the needs of their citizens. But what does this say to us about the ability of the multilateral framework to facilitate more collaboration, not just among nations, but also regionally, for future pandemics and for other emergencies like climate change? There seems to be a need for new frameworks that cut across topical areas and legal frameworks that are already in place. So for example, public health and trade, climate change and trade, public health and climate change. Can the WTO be a focal point for allowing those frameworks and those new agreements to emerge for these times of emergencies? And finally, perhaps most relevant to some of the issues that GLAPA is particularly interested in is this overlap between domestic solutions and global ones. How do you bridge these two in areas of public health, which have to be managed nationally as a public health emergency? In the effort to manage it nationally, we have to ensure that we don't have negative spillovers on other countries. And ensuring the open supply chains access, especially to developing countries. And this is perhaps where trade is most helpful. So for the national solution to the pandemic, you need global solutions. But at the same time, national solutions are very important. So my second point is one that is just much more focused on a few of the trade rules themselves. Frank, of course, mentioned a very important one, the TRIPS waiver. But I wanted to mention two other areas that I thought were particularly relevant to health and the environment, which is subsidies and national security. And so, as Gabrielle has pointed out, with the vaccine production, we've seen it produce very quickly. We've seen a rise in public and private partnerships, which is fantastic. And we've seen a huge investment by governments in private sector to upscale the production of the vaccine. At the same time, this investment of money in R&D has also been accompanied with advanced purchase agreements for many of these pharmaceutical companies, so that this will incentivize them to produce more. It reminds me a little bit of what we saw in some of the decarbonization strategies in the environment, where feed-in tariffs and loan guarantees and et cetera are in place to help industries sort of transition to cleaner energy. So it's not very clear in the last that we've seen of some of the renewable energy cases from the appellate body as to the viability of these types of subsidies in the environmental side. Less clear to me anyway in terms of health. Now, being that these are national emergencies, of course, we have a national security exception and we have emergency exceptions that allow for these types of subsidies. But, I think that the SCM agreement is a bit unclear as to how we we really handle these types of subsidies moving forward. And it does not contain a general exception for subsidies that are in place to fulfill legitimate policy purposes at the domestic level. So we need more collaboration. We need new agreements on subsidies, and especially in the context of emergencies. And finally, with respect to national security, there's a lot that we could say, but as we know, there's been a rise in the use of national security exceptions, particularly at the domestic level, to justify the increase of tariffs. And in some cases, it has led to trade wars, as we saw between China and the United States. And so while we see this national security defense sort of as a defense used not just nationally, but also at the GATT level, we don't have a lot of answers. We have one case, the Russia in transit case, that tells us something about the contours of national security exceptions for that as has been used recently, but there's still more to understand about how these defenses will be used in the future. Should they be used in the context of public health emergencies? Can they be used in the context of climate change? When does an emergency become an emergency enough for the world and for national governments to be able to be justified in raising these types of trade restrictions and so forth? But my concluding thoughts, I wanted to say something, much more on the positive side of things, which is that this is an opportunity, as Gabrielle said, that never miss a good crisis in Spanish for those that are from Latin America viewing us, no hay mal que por bien no venga. They say that there is a silver lining to this crisis, which is that there are some benefits to having increased bilateral, regional, plurilateral collaborations, and this can provide us some lessons even for the multilateral framework. There are concerns for fragmentation, of course, but I think regional agreements can provide for interesting laboratories of experimentation to deal with issues that are closely connected to a region. In areas of regulatory coherence, standardization of harmonization of standards, TBT, SPS measures, energy, more on IP, perhaps more on health as we move forward. And so perhaps at the regional level, we're able to accomplish more of these things on the ground in between countries and other participants in the trade framework that are not necessarily governments. That the multilateral system can then manage somehow. Maybe we have some kind of maybe the role now for the multilateral trading system becomes a manager of this trade pluralism of some sorts. And so maybe we can think about it that way. And finally, the pandemic has shown us that there's a place for institutional flexibility and dynamism, this willingness to adapt quickly, as we've seen the WTO do in finding alternative means for dispute settlement, for example, as being a focal point for gathering information, as Gabrielle pointed out, as a transparency hub, as expert knowledge for vaccine supply management, for issues around digital economy and climate change. So I think that the global pandemic has provided us with this opportunity to rethink the global trading system, the role of its institutions like the WTO, to reconsider the relationship between the multilateral and the regional, between the domestic and the global, and perhaps redefine or reinvent new ways of applying trade rules that we have seen them currently in the GATT and other WTO covered agreements, but perhaps come up with new legal frameworks that better link trade and non-trade areas like trade and health, trade and climate, particularly in times of emergency. So thank you very much. With that, I pass it back to Frank.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. So as moderator, before I turn to questions which are starting to gather, I want to go back to you, Gabrielle, and see if you wanted to begin by responding to any of the points that I or Elizabeth raised. And if you'd rather wait for questions, we can do that instead, but I just wanted to give you that opportunity.
I'm happy to say 2 or 3 things, in particular on the TRIPS waiver, but I will start with where I left or end, that it's interesting that we have statistics of percentage people that have been vaccinated per country, while immunization is really a world issue. So hopefully at some point we'll know that the world, 20% of the world, 15 or something, but it shows how national people still are. On TRIPS waiver, I cannot really take position. As you know, I'm a staff, but I note that those who favor TRIPS mention two very positive aspects, and this supports your point, Frank, that it would change broadly the deal. It's the fact that it would have a direct effect in reducing the power of companies, pharma companies, to decide on the prices and to decide on who gets what. And the effect on price is important, and it's possible because I mentioned, I think, the Merck-Johnson Biden deal, where Biden intervened and said, you know, you do that, so it's possible. The other point that I wanted to mention to support those who talk about this waiver is that, and I think it was raised by Elizabeth, is there an exception to TRIPS? Of course, they are in the TRIPS agreement, but we saw this morning that the president of Europe mentioned that they may have to waive IP rights within Europe because of emergency. Well, I'm just asking the question because I cannot give answers. Well, what's the difference with other countries? And it's not that I'm against intellectual property at all, because we need it to create vaccine. And I was at another webinar a short while ago, and somebody said African countries should just ignore intellectual property and should just copy and produce. But unfortunately, they do not have the knowledge and the capacity because you need a lot of technique, material. It's a complex issue. So the solution needs to be multilateral, as mentioned by the two of you. And my last comment for now will be, if you saw in the press this morning, their risk. China apparently has written that it will accept or recognize only Chinese vaccination when foreigners arrive at its border. Is it a temporary thing? Because we don't know yet whether the other vaccines work, but even apparently if they come from WHO. I'm not too sure, but again, this is just an example of difficulties that arise because governments tend to be, when it's crisis, very nationalistic. And I will end in just saying, this is how the export restrictions rules are drafted. Yes, you can have export restrictions, but very temporary if it's a crisis and you need it. There's still many export restrictions in place. Are they justified under this exception of Article 11? Maybe they have another justification, but there's no hesitation that whether it's about import-export restrictions on food, on agriculture, subsidies, customs red and green light. This was negotiated with customs union, customs organization, WTO and all that. So there's trade everywhere, but more importantly, as Frank said, and Elizabeth, the biological, physical solution to the pandemic is multilateral, but the societal and sort of more global solution is also multilateral. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. So let's turn to some of the questions that have started to accumulate. And the first one, following up on this theme of, which is emerging in some of the questions about crisis and opportunity. Elizabeth, you had mentioned that there's an opportunity here for institutional change. And one of our interrogators has asked, have you noticed new models of global governance arising, or can you see some hope of how they could be configured in the future? In other words, what shape are these changes taking, or what shape could they change? And what do you see so far?
Thank you, Frank. Well, that's a very interesting question. And just putting in a quick plug, you'll find out more when you read my book on trade trade through a sustainable development lens next year. Because I've been thinking about this a lot, about we do need new models of governance. And I think trade is a very important piece of that. I also think it's very important, the optics, as you said, Frank. I think that trade, this is an opportunity for trade to take on a position as part of the solution for everyone, for developing countries in particular, who need more, but also for the developed world in terms of the balance that they need and the social policy space to be able to implement measures to address national crises like a health pandemic, like climate change issues, like energy, that really have to be managed locally. So in terms of actual governmental institutional frameworks, those are harder to see currently, because what we have in place are frameworks that are very they have been created to deal with certain topical areas, right? So trade has been confined in a way to trade issues, right? Which is not human rights, which is not environment per se. But over the years, it has had to deal with these non-trade issues through linkages because there's been so much overlap, particularly in the non-tariff barrier area. And this is where I think that there are opportunities through fragmentation, through the rise of regionalism and bilateralism, where allowing governments to work across borders, allowing more transparency in terms of how regulation across border happens, this transnational regulatory governance. I think there's an opportunity there. And what I think is the opportunity at the multilateral level is to think about these institutions as being managers of these various sort of laboratories and have a stronger connection between the multilateral frameworks and these regional ones, rather than them being in opposition to one another, that one is a regional framework, the EU or Mercosur or USMCA, but as part of the larger system. Is there a way in which we can have a better dialogue? Clearly, through the dispute settlement body, we moved forward quite a bit on some of the questions around how to interpret some of these trade rules, but it was very multilateral focused, which is not a mistake, but it leaves out sort of the need for, there might be times where the dispute settlement is better served at the regional level. But somehow managed at the multilateral. And what that looks like operationally, that I'm not sure. I would leave that to experts that work in these institutions like Gabrielle to think about actual tools that can be put into place to help sort of create these types of governance frameworks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So moving from the sort of forward thinking, what kinds of changes might be possible and necessary, I want to move to a question that's been raised by a participant about a very perennial question, which is this issue of enforcement and accountability. And the attendee asks, do you see trade as being an avenue of holding China accountable for their bad actions during the initial stages of the pandemic? So that's a question that would invite anyone to respond.
Well, I'm not sure Gabrielle Gabrielle, I'll let you respond if you'd like first.
I was just going to say, I don't think the WTO is the forum as such because we're still not too clear about mistakes, no mistakes. But what I wanted to say, and I leave Elizabeth and you, Frank, really, to respond to this, because it's almost a international moral issue. But what has come out of the WTO and the pandemic more broadly is the crucial importance of transparency. And this, I think there's no way that the governments will go backward. Transparency is a principle, yes, And it was also mentioned and practiced in the trade policy review mechanism, and you know it's everywhere. But this is more what I call with my students active transparency, that it's not only notification, but the right to ask questions, the obligation to respond. And this is what the world is doing with difficulties, but with China at the moment trying to understand what happened. But, you know, even if we know the reasons and whether China is responsible or not, what is important is more the future pandemic and not to repeat mistakes. And again, the role of transparency is crucial. So I would just say the answer is transparency, transparency, and transparency all the time. Thank you.
Thank you. I would just add to that, I entirely agree that right now the level of challenge the system is facing means we have to be forward-looking as much as possible, which what political capital we expend. I think the question of international relations in China, as everyone acknowledges, is a very complex question. I don't think the trade system by itself can address that question effectively. I think that it needs to be, this trade disciplines need to be a part of that, but I think the issues are much more fundamental. And I would rather see the trading system be focusing its energy on positive steps in governance and building as we're starting to outline here, without neglecting the need for traditional trade enforcement actions, of course.
Yes, I would agree. I'm not sure trade is the right place, although I think that transparency is a huge piece of this picture. But you know, trade has been used in the past to try to create accountability, and it's interesting to see whether or not it has worked or not. But I wanted to say, you know, something about using trade as a tool to sort of force nations to do things, right? So even in good causes like the environment, sustainability, you know, Gabrielle mentioned the US proposal about the environmental sustainability defense, if you will. There's something similar in the USMCA. You know, it's in a small footnote, but where it basically says that a violation of environmental obligation under the USMCA is also a violation of trade and investment. It'll be interesting to see, I mean, we've never seen that before, and it'll be interesting to see if that is used in a way to claim a trade violation because a developing country may not be able to comply fully with the environmental obligations that have been placed on them. And so I don't know if that's a useful tool, if part of the purpose of trade is to help countries develop economically. So this is why I say that the governance piece and finding agreements and frameworks that better sort of address these overlaps are really crucial, where countries can come up with solutions that are not coercive, but are collaborative to help countries be able to afford to be environmentally more sustainable and so forth.
Thank you. So let me combine a couple of questions. Oh, no, please, Gabrielle, go ahead.
Well, just a small thing. Yes, people on this US proposal, what is interesting from a perspective of evolution is that behind this US proposal, there's the principle that there is an obligation to deal with sustainability, to take action. And it's interesting, it's done, you know, as a countervailing duty, but that's a plus. Yeah. And the other point mentioned again by Elizabeth that I fully support is this issue that trade has always been used, not only about trading food and shoes and cars, but trade has often been used as a tool to punish. You don't respect human rights, I use trade, and this is where it gets difficult, using trade as countermeasure in public international law. And that's why we have to make sure we don't get trapped. But the one comment I wanted to add on your initial comment, Frank, that is the COVID was a crisis and a crisis. And that's very true, but there's, I think, hope because the COVID has shaken up. But the one thing that I want to mention is the new approach of joint statement initiatives. These are proposals by a subgroup of members who got fed up of waiting for the consensus. And they said, whether it's legal or not legal, let's talk about that afterwards. Now we negotiate. So we have, for instance, on e-commerce, on domestic regulation, now on sustainability. So if you attend those meetings, and I attended some recently, it's what happened 25 years ago when I started at the WTO, because those in the room want to improve things. So going back to your more fundamental question, Frank and Elizabeth, of institutional structure, the GSI offers, we're not too sure how it fits, but sometimes you need to break a rule in order to set up a better one. In the US, you saw that, whether it's women's rights or other rights. And I think it's a very fundamental point raised by Frank. The crisis stimulate changes, but the prior broader difficulty of the WTO were starting to respond. And we saw the pandemic led to at least 2 or 3, depending on, of those new GSI. It's interesting, I believe. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gabrielle. And that's a great departure point for a couple of questions that I want to bundle, and which will probably be our last question. So if you could all keep in mind that this is a chance to leave us with your parting comments. I think it's partly about, again, this theme of crisis, which are what are the key lessons that have to be taken, and choices and decisions that have to be made by international trade institutions in order to really harvest the lessons of the pandemic. So what are those key choices and decisions that should be taken by institutions of international trade? And I would add to that an opportunity, Gabrielle, to clarify what is it that the WTO as an institution, as a secretariat, as a structure, what is their key decision or choice that must be made, separate from what the member states do or not do? But what do you feel like as an institution, it's important that the WTO do in response to this?
Elizabeth, do you start or I start?
No, please start.
Okay. So in one word, I would say 2 things. What the institution can do is to put in practice, and I'll have a suggestion after, solutions that take into account that there's no solution that is individual, regional, national. The only way to deal with a pandemic, and to some extent it's like climate change, but it's more obvious because it touches on survival of human nature, is if we collaborate, coordinate. Because even if my country, Canada, is all vaccinated and the neighboring country is not, unless we don't fly and we don't move, there's no solution. It's quite simple, but it's very true. And what the Secretariat can do is, this is why my last document, in a way, in the health series, was this proposal from last Friday from a group of countries saying the Secretariat, in addition to its normal job, should do all it can now to enhance production capacity of vaccine with firms, something that was inconceivable a few weeks ago, having the WTO and our new DG, outstanding woman. This was her first statement. We need, yes, talk about the trips, talk about this and all sorts of things, but we also need to vaccinate people. And for this, you need to have a big pharma that invest, that start, we need to share. So her message is the answer, I think, to your question, Frank. The Secretariat and her, and this is the mandate of this last document of last week, where the Secretariat and the DGs are asked to do things, to act, not to be traditionally prudent. We cannot do something, to do things and to report to members. And also things like what Elizabeth and Sabrina organize. These are all sort of transparency exercise at the level of the society, NGOs, and all this. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Elizabeth, do you want to take 1 minute and give us your last thoughts on that?
Well, I would just say I I think that I heard this from the new DG, who seems like an amazing woman, the first woman and African woman to be a DG of the WTO. That trade is not just about institutions and about commerce; it's about people, right? And so I think that we as trade lawyers, as trade scholars, we need to find a way to change the narrative around trade. In a way that is palatable to people, to citizens, that they understand that trade is a tool that can be used to help them, to improve their lives, to provide access to these vaccines, not as an inhibitor. And finding that narrative is really, really important, I think, moving forward for the institutions and for the framework to succeed. Because without buy-in from the people and national governments, it's hard to understand what it means. All right, it's a very technical field, but also, from a people's perspective, Geneva's far away, and so just like Washington, D.C. is far away from Houston, so there's got to be a way that we change the narrative, that trade is part of the solution and it is part of their daily lives.
Well, thanks. And if I could just beg your indulgence for 1 minute over time, I'll throw in two last thoughts with that. One is that I think we have to collapse this artificial distinction between what we expect as a wealthy society for ourselves and what we expect other societies to put up with. And I'm thinking here on a very specific technical issue of trade adjustment assistance. We expect in a wealthy social welfare capitalist democracy that we support workers who have been displaced by trade. And yet we don't take that as a global responsibility, we leave it as a national responsibility. So I think one change is recognizing that if there's a global economy, there's going to be a globally displaced workers, and it's a global responsibility to see how to address trade adjustment assistance. And I've suggested elsewhere, a financial transactions tax linked to trade would be a logical way to help shift the financial burden away from individual states and towards the collective that's benefiting from the system. And then the last point in terms of the narrative you mentioned, Elizabeth, I would say, and I've suggested this elsewhere as well, that we have to recapture a vision of trade as consensual exchanges. All of us know what it means to be in a bargain that's working for us and not working for us. But when we get to the geopolitical aspects of trade, we leave that understanding behind. But I think that's the understanding that's fueling nationalism and economic resentment and crisis and globalization, that the system is leaving a lot of people behind. So I think recapturing and refocusing on what trade is a part of that process. And with that, I just want to thank you all for a very stimulating hour. We've reached our conclusion. Thank you for our participants and attendees for listening in. And it's been a privilege to speak about this with all of you, and I look forward to the next series. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to the speakers. The next webinar will be on the 15th of April. It's been an amazing webinar. Thanks a lot, Gabrielle, Elizabeth, and Frank. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.